Hello, I'm Bob Trubshaw. I want to talk to you today about some queens, some kings, and an ox. Specifically, 3 queens, 3 kings, and a Durham Ox, the Durham Ox. You haven't already guessed, we're talking about the names of pubs. Well, actually, let's be pedantic, we're talking about the names of inns. And not just a random collection of inns, but inns on drovers' roads. Now, to be fair, I actually don't know a huge amount about drovers' roads, but I do know about 2 of them. One which starts in Leicestershire and heads off all the way across Lincolnshire to the east coast, part of it known as the Salters Way, and one which runs north-south. It actually forms the boundary between Leicestershire and Lincolnshire for most of its length. If you imagine it comes up from Stamford and goes up parallel to the A1 towards Long Bennington. It's known by 3 different names. It's known as the Souston Way, it's known as the Drift, and since about the 1980s it's been known as the Viking Way, although I don't think a great many Vikings actually walked along it. And so let me explain some more. Here we are, West Leicestershire, looking pretty much at Charnwood Forest area, a town called Thringston, close to Colville, and whilst there's nothing on the ground these days, there is some evidence for a Roman road that runs effectively due east, or due west, depending which way you're travelling, across the River Soar at Barrow-on-Soar. Now, I don't think there was ever a Roman bridge at Barrow. There was probably a ferry, just maybe sort of a pontoon bridge, something like that. Certainly by Anglo-Saxon times, it was quite an important Anglo-Saxon trading area at Barrow-on-Soar. And the name itself doesn't refer to a burial mound type barrow. It's a different Old English word, barrow, which means a sacred grove. So kind of an interesting place in its own right. But that is sort of secondary to anything I want to talk about. It's the road running from Barrow-on-Soar and heading northeast through a place called Six Hills, which is a misnomer. It's no hills there, it's a plateau-like area. But at that point, the road we're interested in crosses the Foss Way, now the A46, on the stretch running from Leicester to Newark, but of course the Foss Way itself runs all the way down from the Dorset coast through Cirencester, up to Leicester, onto Newark and beyond to Lincoln. And it's at Six Hills that we encounter the first of these inns of interest to me, the Durham Ox, more later. Carrying on to the northeastwards, the route then follows the top of a very dramatic ridge. Land to the north of that road just drops away very sharply into the Vale of Belvoir. At this point, we're on a road that is known to have been called the Salters Way, sometimes just the Salt Way, but we also know that it was being used by the Romans to get to the place that we now call Goby Marwood, where they were extracting iron and smelting iron and so forth. The road sort of just slightly changes direction at one point, and these days it's only a bridle path. That's a consequence of ironstone extraction in the earlier 20th century. The road was just closed for a time while they dug out the ironstone, and then it picks up a road again at White Lodge Farm. Now, White Lodge is kind of interesting because white place names generally are on saltways. Something goes together there, as you might imagine. So, White Lodge Farm continuing northeast. The route then follows a little single track road. It wasn't used to be very busy till they invented sat-navs, and now it's a single track road with a few passing places, and oh boy is it busy, because the sat-nav takes you there rather than going 2 sides of a triangle to get to the same place via Waltham-on-the-Wolds. But anyway, you come off a single track road onto a rather nice stretch of the A607. This is the road from Leicester through Melton Mowbray to Grantham, and we join the 607 for a mile or so down a steep hill into the village of Crowston Kerriel. And we then climb out of Crowston Kerriel. The 607 deviates to the left, going directly towards Grantham, whereas the Salters Way continues on its original course, and is actually a road known as Gorse Lane. So Goby Marwood effectively the Roman part of the road ceased, because that's where the Roman, and before that the Iron Age, iron extraction was taking place. So we're pretty much now on something known as the Salter's Way, clearly associated with the salt trade, but very likely starting off in the medieval period as the wool trade. This is where the great bales of wool were being taken from the English Midlands to the East Coast ports, and North Norfolk and so forth, for export to the continent. The salt would have developed as a return trade, and we do know that there were salt pans around Boston coast, the Holland coast, and around King's Lynn. So as the road leaves the A607 and continues along Gorse Lane, it actually crosses the county boundary of Leicestershire and Lincolnshire, which is the Siston Way, and that's the location of the Three Queens Inn. There's a slight sort of deviation in the route, then continues to cross the Witham at Saltersford and continues on southeast of Grantham, where it eventually picks up the A52, and it's the A52 which continues towards Boston and King's Lynn. At that point it goes through the village of Threckingham, and recently rebranded as Threekingham, but I will call it Threckingham. But just to contradict me, the pub there is called the Three Kings Inn. Speaking of inns, the village of Crowston Kerriel, tucked down between two rather steep hills, has got a pub called the Geese and Fountain. I'm not quite sure how long it's been called the Geese and Fountain. You can see the 3D sign there, which includes 4 geese, and a strange little thing in the middle of the geese, which perhaps doesn't show very well in this particular photograph. And that is a model of this, which is the fountain. You have to understand that before mains water in Crowston Kerriel, there was like a conduit system that brought together several rather poor sources of water, little springs. And the excess water went down to the bottom of the valley and just discharged from this fountain. And the reason it's designed this way is that originally it had a canvas hose from the metal outlet, and it's high enough that you can refill the water tanks of traction engines. Very helpful, because clearly the 2 steep hills, and they're long as well, steep, either side of Crowston Kerriel, yes, you would need to refill the water tanks on a traction engine before you're able to get out of Crowston. So it doesn't flow quite so well all the time, but after reasonable rain, it's still flowing. So the pub takes its name from the fountain. To be honest, I've never seen any geese around the fountain, but then again, this is the A607, so they would have a fairly short life, I think, if we tried to have geese around there now, but no doubt in the past. This is where the Salter's Way leaves the A607 to the east of Crowston Kerriel. The gap in the trees there is where the junction has been sort of deliberately made into a right angle, and the actual road alignment is just much more oblique. And it's about a mile along there to the east again, still following Salter's Way. We come to the site of the Three Queens Inn. It was demolished about 1950. It had been a farmhouse for most of the early 20th century. We're not quite sure when it ceased being an inn. It would have ceased to have much traffic from the drovers once railways took over from actually droving cattle down roads in towards London. So you're going to say the 1870s, that sort of period, droving cattle and other livestock, including geese, ceased to be a big thing, and therefore the clientele of this drover inn, which is quite remote, it wouldn't have any other clientele, clearly the trade just dropped off. We don't have any photographs or other illustrations of the Three Queens Inn, but what did these rural inns and taverns look like? Well, this is a rather romantic little painting by an artist called Georgina Lara. I'm not quite sure when she was born or when she died, but as an artist she produced paintings for about a decade in the 1860s. She would have seen these sort of pubs operational. I think the Three Queens Inn would have looked a little bit like this. It might have only been one property rather than what seems to be 2 properties here. Barrels stacked out in the yard, fairly informal, not overly tidy, but these were rural premises, and would have catered for, well, drovers were regarded as a fairly rough sort, so there was no good having sort of, best crockery and silver serving dishes, because that just did not go with what droving inns were all about. Now, in the 1860s, there is no way that Georgina could have gone inside one of these taverns or inns and so forth. They were male-only zones except for the staff and so forth. It's a different culture then from how we think of roadside pubs now. I've yet to find an illustration of a 19th century rural inn. This, although it's from the 17th century and from somewhere in what we would now think of as Holland, I think gets the flavour. Perhaps English men didn't dress quite in the same way, different style of caps and berets perhaps, but, take away the colour and you're looking at pretty much what went on in one of those taverns and inns and so forth. Plenty of ale going down, a little bit of sort of sleeping, a bit of gambling, which was illegal in Britain at the time, but these were, rural pubs, so you didn't really have to worry about that sort of thing. Quite informal, relatively cosy by the standards of the time. So, from Saltersford, the Salters Way goes through Threckingham and along the A52 towards Boston. This is the Three Kings Inn. The A52 now bypasses the village itself, and in recent years, presumably the parish council decided to rename the village Threckingham. There is actually a bit of folklore that says 3 Viking kings are buried in the parish. I don't regard it so much as folklore, it is fake law really. Somebody sort of trying to reverse engineer the possible pronunciation of the place name. When you actually look into the old spellings of Threckingham, it's Tretchingham. It's actually something different. Tretchingham we can sort of unpack as the harm or the homestead of the Ingers, the descendants of, the followers of, someone who was probably called Trican or something like that. So Threckingham isn't actually the original pronunciation, the T has become a TH, but it's certainly more accurate than Threckingham. So this is looking at the two routes together, the Salters Way and also the Souston Lane, otherwise known as the Drift, and the Drift here is a reference to droving. It's just another term for what people did. See that Souston is actually the only village through which this routeway passes, and it actually only passes through on the edge of the village. It starts on what we now think of as the A1, but would have been known as the Great North Road, and it runs roughly parallel to it and rejoins just north of Stamford. What it does do is bypass Grantham, and that will make a lot of sense. You really don't want to be taking herds of cattle and sheep or goodness knows what else through the middle of a place like Grantham. You really do want to pass round the side, and there are similar arrangements that I'm aware of for people passing around Leicester, which is on the Foss Way, but there was actually a sort of a medieval bypass which ran to the sort of northwest side of Leicester itself, and actually those roads are still known as the Foss Way South, the Foss Way North and so forth, but they're not the original line of the Roman road, which is much more straight and direct, but it stopped anybody who didn't want to sell their goods in Leicester from having to pay the tolls of passing through Leicester. Does that make sense? I hope so. So we've got the Durham Ox to the west of this map, we've got the Three Kings Inn to the right of this map, and where these two routeways cross was the site of the Three Queens Inn. Here's just some examples of what the Souston Way looks like. Here I'm standing close to the little hamlet of Stenwith and looking south. And here I've gone towards Woolsthorpe, a little location shown on OS maps as Brewer's Grave. I'm looking south. You can travel along the Souston Way. It's a bridle way, so you can walk it, you can ride on a horse if you wanted to, and I've actually cycled it sometime in the early 1990s. It's fairly doable. Here we are at just to the east of Harston. The bridge there is one of the few survivals of some extensive iron ore extraction in that area, and the bridge took the trackway over a little railway that took the railway wagons from the quarry to the mainline railway. Here we are, further south from there, looking north. We're just outside the village of Buckminster, and clearly here the Souston Way has actually become a roadway. It's now tarmacked. Just another look at Souston Lane here. We're standing at the site of the Three Queens Inn. It would have been located just off the photograph to the left. We're looking south. This is rather a lovely nature reserve in the spring. Lots and lots of flowers around May into June. And this is looking north. Pretty much the same location. Now, the Three Queens Inn. How did it get its name? Well, one option is it referred to three queens, Mary Tudor, Margaret Tudor, and Catherine of Aragon, who were not only three queens, but they were three sisters. Admittedly, one was a sister-in-law, but let's not get too pedantic. Did it? Perhaps there were three ladies who ran the Three Queens Inn. Now, these aren't ladies who ran any sort of pub. They're not queens either. They, according to the caption to the photograph, they are actually chorus girls. But it's probably how women of some social standing would have dressed in the late 19th century or very early 20th century. But we have to go back a bit further and understand that queen was not necessarily a word that was flattering. Going back to sort of Anglo-Saxon times, 1,000 years ago, yes, the wife of the king was referred to as a queen, but they were sort of regarded in about the same way that we would think of as gold diggers. Girls who sort of would, put themselves about a bit if they were going to get some benefit from it and so forth. And we have to say that the sort of women you would encounter in drovers' inns were sort of, they would have connotations of ladies of easy virtue. So in a sense it would be a survival of the original sense of queen. That's all maybe. I can't prove any of it, and I think the most likely reason that this inn was called the Three Queens Inn was because there was already a Three Kings Inn at Threckingham, and it just next stop along the road, really. Why wouldn't you? It's got a sense of fun to it. Shouldn't read too much into this, I think. We just accept that they may have been some ladies associated with the Three Queens Inn, but maybe it was just a punning name, and it was run by blokes all along. There's nothing unusual about the names of pubs having threesomes. From historical sources, we know that Leicester had a pub called the Three Cranes. In fact, at different times it had two different pubs called the Three Cranes. This is the bird, not the lifting equipment. It also had the Three Crowns and the Three Cups. I drunk in a couple of other Three Crowns, the one at Barrow-on-Soar, and quite frequently in the one of my former home village of Wymswold. If you go to Kibworth, there's the Three Horseshoes. Loughborough has a pub called the Three Nuns, but the earlier sources tell us that it was actually the Three Tons, and that makes very good sense because 3 tons is the arms of the Vintners Company, and no surprise that there was another 3 tons in Melton Mowbray. Another of my watering holes was the Three Swans at Market Harborough. And so let's just look a little bit more at the origins of the Durham Ox name. Now, the Durham Ox is quite a common pub name, or inn name, but mostly associated with drovers' routes. It sometimes is about your only good evidence that there was a drovers' route. Now, the Durham Ox was real. There's a lot of legends about it, but it was actually a real animal. And I can tell you it was born in March 1796, and it died on the 15th of April in 1807. In the meantime, it had made her a fortune for its owners. Why? Well, it was a forerunner of the breed of cattle that we now call Shorthorns, and it was because of a gentleman called Charles Colling up in County Durham, who had picked up on the ideas of Robert Bakewell, who had a farm at Dishley near Loughborough, in the latest ideas of breeding livestock. Another long story there if you want to get into it. But Bakewell was actually breeding longhorn cattle. It was Charles Colling who developed these shorthorn breeds. Basically, the Durham Ox was sold to a chap called John Day, who was based near Lincoln, and he renamed him the Durham Ox, had a special carriage to transport him, and toured the Durham Ox around England and Scotland, exhibiting at agricultural fairs and such like. And various artists painted this animal. It was remarkable for size and weight, but also its good shape. It developed the standards by which the shorthorn was to be defined. Not only were the paintings of the Durham Ox, but there was even pottery decorated with prints based on the paintings, just to sort of put on your, well, not on your mantelpiece, really, on your dresser. Serve for Sunday roast on this blue transferware bowl. All very impressive. Sadly, the ox managed to injure itself when he was getting out of his carriage in 1807, and about 3 months later he had to be slaughtered. At the point at which he died, his weight was reputed to be about 1,200 kilos. Definitely famous in his day and after his death as well. So this is the Durham Ox at Six Hills in Leicestershire, and it's the oldest illustration that we have, and it was published in 1926. We have this photograph probably taken in the late 1940s, when it had been expanded into sort of this Tudor-Beathan style of architecture. The photograph was published in 1950. And that's how the premises had been further expanded, and the name had changed to the Six Hills Hotel, a photograph taken in 2002, and since then the name has changed yet again, and it's become a rehabilitation centre. That's a map, the Ordnance Survey map of 1876, showing the Durham Ox Inn and its outbuildings on the northwest side of the Fosse Way, and the Salters Way running immediately to the south. Now, a lot of things have changed. I mean, Fosse Way has been now a dual carriageway. There's been an interchange. It doesn't look a lot like that now, but that's how it would have been known when it was a drover's inn. So, after I'd begun researching these inns, and they just intrigued me in their own right, something odd fell into place. I worked out how far apart they are. And it turns out that if you leave the Durham Ox, you have to travel 14 miles to get to the Three Queens Inn along the Salters Way. And then to get to the Three Kings Inn at Threckingham, you travel another 14 miles. Well, that's kind of intriguing. And if you actually look at the distance between Long Bennington and Stamford, Sewston, which would have had an inn on that route, but the inn hasn't survived, and I certainly haven't been able to find out what it was called. But Sewston is effectively 14 miles from Stamford and 14 miles from Long Bennington. Clearly the Three Queens Inn kind of mucks up that distance because it's in between there, so you know, if you could stop off for a swift half in the middle of the day if you timed it right. I'm not sure whether that actually happened. Clearly you can't locate these things to perfection. But 14 miles crops up between Long Bennington and Sewston, Sewston to Stamford, Three Kings to the Three Queens, and the Three Queens to the Durham Ox. I have to assume that this isn't just coincidence, and actually drovers aimed to travel 14 miles a day, 2 miles an hour, which I think is a reasonable rate to expect a herd of cattle or a flock of sheep and so forth to actually achieve. I have no direct experience of droving cattle and so forth. I actually know relatively little about drovers' routes, as I say. It can be quite hard to research them. You require local knowledge, and least of all can I find out much about the original inns on drovers' routes. But if anybody watching this video knows their own local area well enough, I would suggest they just sort of get a map out and check to see if this 14-mile distance works in their area. Perhaps if their area is much hillier or something, then it doesn't work. That would be predictable. And if you can, I'll leave my email address in the comment section below, and you can get in touch with me. I'll be most grateful. Just a few words of thanks. My understanding of the Salters Way was greatly enhanced by an email from Matt Pennyfold, and an almost a chance encounter with a Mrs. Lamley led to me receiving very useful information from the Grantham Journal of 1986 about the Three Queens farm, as it was at the time that Mrs. Lamley's parents owned it. And all that information about 3 crowns and 3 cups and so forth on Leicestershire inn names is the work of Eric Swift, which was published in 1976.